A millionaire's autistic son was born paralyzed in the mountain town of Whitefish, Montana. For 9 years, despite world-class specialists and millions spent, the boy never spoke a word. Then came the harsh winter of 2025, when a former nurse became their maid and noticed something that would change everything. "Mama coming home?" The word shattered 9 years of silence like glass breaking in the frozen air. Mason Thompson's hands trembled as he knelt beside his son's wheelchair, tears freezing on his cheeks in the Montana cold. Behind them, Grace Parker stood in the doorway, her own eyes wide with disbelief. Nobody could have known what evil had been done to this innocent boy. Nobody could have predicted that the very doctor trusted to heal him had been slowly poisoning his mind and body for years. And nobody, not the specialist, not the therapist, not even his own father, had realized that Caleb Thompson had been screaming silently for help all along. The blizzard outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath for what would come next. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, October had painted the Montana mountains in brilliant gold and crimson, but inside the Thompson mansion, everything remained colorless. Mason Thompson sat in his leather chair, watching his 9-year-old son Caleb through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Whitefish Lake. The boy hadn't moved in over an hour, his wheelchair positioned exactly where the morning nurse had left him. Mason had built his fortune in cybersecurity, protecting people's digital lives with algorithms and firewalls. But he couldn't protect his own son from whatever darkness had claimed him at birth. The doctors called it severe autism with associated paralysis. Dr. Victor Thornfield, the region's most respected pediatric neurologist, had been treating Caleb since he was 3 years old. "The boy's condition is complex," Dr. Thornfield had explained years ago, his silver hair and confident demeanor inspiring trust. "We must maintain strict medication protocols to prevent episodes that could harm him further." Episodes. Mason had never seen one, but he trusted the expert. He trusted the daily injections, the careful monitoring, the gradual increases in dosages as Caleb grew. What else could a father do when faced with the incomprehensible? Sarah, his wife, had tried to question the treatments once. She'd been brilliant, a former teacher with an intuitive understanding of children. But after Caleb's birth, something had broken inside her mind. The doctors said it was postpartum psychosis, made worse by the stress of caring for a disabled child. 3 years ago, she'd suffered a complete breakdown and had to be institutionalized. Now Mason lived alone with his silent son and a rotating staff of nurses who came and went like seasonal help. None stayed long. They found the mansion too quiet, too heavy with unspoken grief. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke his reverie. Through the window he watched a battered pickup truck navigate the circular driveway. The latest applicant for the live-in caregiver position, their 5th this year. A woman stepped out, tall and lean with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun. She moved with purpose, not the tentative steps of someone intimidated by wealth. Something about her reminded him of Sarah before the illness took her away. Mason didn't know that Grace Parker carried her own devastating loss, or that she'd driven 1,500 miles from Tennessee with nothing but a duffel bag and a heart full of desperate hope for redemption. He couldn't have imagined that this stranger would soon uncover a truth so horrific it would shatter everything he believed about healing, about trust, and about the price of blind faith in authority. Grace Parker's boots left wet prints on the marble foyer as she stepped into the Thompson mansion, her breath still visible in the October chill. The warmth inside felt artificial, like stepping into a museum where everything was preserved, but nothing was truly alive. Mason Thompson emerged from what looked like a study, his expensive sweater and pressed khakis making her feel suddenly conscious of her thrift store interview clothes. "Miss Parker, I presume." His handshake was firm, but his eyes held the hollow look she'd seen in too many grieving parents. "Thank you for driving all this way." "Yes, sir, Mr. Thompson. And thank you for considering me." Grace's Tennessee accent felt thicker in this rarefied air, but she wouldn't apologize for who she was. "I know my credentials might not be what you're used to." Mason led her through rooms that belonged in architectural magazines, soaring ceilings, Native American art, furniture that probably cost more than she'd made in years of nursing. But it was the silence that struck her most. No television, no music, no sounds of childhood anywhere. "Caleb is in the sunroom," Mason said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. He doesn't respond much to new people. Don't take it personally." The sunroom faced the lake, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of mountains reflected in dark water. And there, silhouetted against the vastness, sat a small figure in a wheelchair. Even from behind, Grace could see the rigid posture, the unnatural stillness that spoke of deep medication. "Hey there, sugar," she said softly, moving slowly into Caleb's line of sight. "I'm Grace." The boy didn't acknowledge her presence. His dark hair fell across his forehead, and his hands lay motionless in his lap. But Grace had learned to look beyond the obvious. She noticed how his eyes tracked toward the window when a gust of wind shook the pines outside. How his breathing changed slightly when a distant owl called across the water. "He's been like this since birth," Mason explained, pain evident in every word. "Dr. Thornfield has tried everything, medications, therapies, specialized equipment. Nothing seems to reach him." Grace knelt beside the wheelchair, studying Caleb's profile. Something about the set of his jaw, the way his eyelids fluttered when that owl called again, reminded her of her own daughter Emma in those final weeks. The same distant look, the same unnatural stillness that came from too much medication, suppressing a fighting spirit. "What medications is he on currently?" she asked, her nursing instincts kicking in. Mason rattled off a list that made Grace's blood run cold. Risperdal, Haldol, Ativan, heavy antipsychotics and sedatives that would knock out a grown man, let alone a 9-year-old boy. She'd seen this cocktail before, in the final months of Emma's life, when Dr. Thornfield had promised it would quiet her distress. "That's quite a regimen for a child," she said carefully. "Dr. Thornfield says it's necessary to prevent episodes. Caleb can become agitated without proper management." Grace bit back her first response. In 12 years of pediatric nursing, she'd learned that the most dangerous words in medicine were "trust me" from a doctor who wouldn't explain his reasoning. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small wooden owl carved by her late grandfather. "May I?" She placed the owl on the windowsill where Caleb could see it. For the first time since she'd entered the room, the boy's head turned, just slightly, but unmistakably toward the carving. His lips parted as if he might speak, then closed again. "Remarkable," Mason breathed. "He never—" "How did you know?" "Sometimes children communicate in ways we don't expect," Grace said, her heart racing. "They just need someone willing to listen." As if summoned by their conversation, the front door chimed and authoritative footsteps echoed through the mansion. Dr. Victor Thornfield swept into the sunroom like he owned it, his silver hair perfectly styled, his manner radiating the kind of confidence that brooked no questions. "Mason, good to see you. And you must be the new caregiver." His eyes assessed Grace with the cold calculation of a man used to being the smartest person in the room. "I hope Mason has explained the importance of maintaining Caleb's medication schedule. Any deviation could trigger a dangerous episode." "Of course, Doctor." Grace forced a smile while memorizing every detail of this man who held so much power over this family. The expensive suit, the Rolex, the way he spoke about Caleb as if the boy weren't sitting right there. Dr. Thornfield moved to a medical bag on the side table and began preparing a syringe. Time for his afternoon dose. This particular combination has taken years to perfect. Grace watched the routine with growing unease. The amount of liquid in that syringe could sedate an adult. As the needle pierced Caleb's arm, she saw something that made her stomach clench. The boy's eyes went wide with unmistakable fear before the medication dragged him back into chemically induced compliance. "There we go," Dr. Thornfield said, disposing of the needle with practiced efficiency. "He'll be peaceful for the rest of the evening." Peaceful. Grace had heard that word before, in another state, in another hospital room, just before they'd sedated her daughter into a coma she'd never wake from. 2 weeks into November, Grace had settled into the rhythm of the Thompson household like a secret agent gathering intelligence. She rose before dawn, prepared Caleb's breakfast, and watched Dr. Thornfield's daily medication ritual with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to trust authority figures in white coats. The routine never varied. Thornfield arrived at precisely 9 a.m., spent exactly 12 minutes with his patient, administered 3 different injections, and departed with the satisfied air of a man who believed he was saving lives. What he didn't know was that Grace had been a pediatric ICU nurse for 12 years before Emma's death destroyed her faith in the medical system. She recognized every drug in those syringes: haloperidol to suppress movement, lorazepam to prevent anxiety, and something else, something that made her stomach turn when she looked it up in her old nursing manual. Pancuronium bromide, a paralytic agent typically used during surgery to prevent muscle movement. "Why would a child need a paralytic?" she whispered to herself in the empty kitchen, her hands shaking as she held the medical reference book. Children with autism didn't need chemical restraints. They needed understanding, patience, and often just someone willing to meet them where they were. Grace began her own careful observation protocol. She noted everything: Caleb's eye movements before and after medications, his breathing patterns, the subtle ways his body tried to respond to stimuli before the drugs kicked in. Most telling of all, she watched his fear response when Dr. Thornfield entered the room. The boy's pupils would dilate, his breathing would quicken, and his hands would tremble slightly before going still. That wasn't autism. That was terror. On November 15th, while Mason worked in his study and the house settled into its afternoon quiet, Grace made her first move. She'd prepared identical-looking vitamin B12 injections, clear liquid that would fool a casual observer. When Dr. Thornfield arrived for his routine visit, Grace intercepted him in the foyer. "Doctor, I was wondering if you could explain Caleb's medication schedule to me. As his primary caregiver, I want to make sure I understand his needs." Thornfield's smile was patronizing, the kind reserved for women he considered beneath his intellectual level. "My dear, these are complex neurological interventions. Your job is simply to ensure compliance with the schedule I've established. The boy's brain chemistry requires precise management." "Of course," Grace replied, matching his condescending tone with Southern sweetness. "I just want to be sure I'm giving him the right injections if you're ever unavailable." She'd counted on his arrogance, and it didn't disappoint. Thornfield explained the color-coded syringes, the injection sites, and the timing as if speaking to a child. He never noticed Grace memorizing every detail, or the way her jaw tightened when he referred to Caleb as the subject rather than a boy with a name. That afternoon, after Thornfield left, Grace sat beside Caleb's wheelchair in the sunroom. The boy stared out at the lake where snow was beginning to dust the mountains, his expression as blank as always. But Grace had learned to read the subtle signs, the way his breathing changed when she spoke, how his fingers twitched almost imperceptibly when she mentioned his mother. "I know you're in there, sugar," she whispered, glancing toward the door to make sure Mason wasn't nearby. And I think somebody's been keeping you locked away." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden owl her grandfather had carved. This time, instead of placing it on the windowsill, she put it directly in Caleb's hand, closing his fingers around it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, so slowly she almost missed it, Caleb's thumb moved across the carved surface. His eyes flickered, just for an instant, to meet hers. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. "That's right, baby. You're still in there." The next morning, she implemented her plan. When Dr. Thornfield prepared Caleb's injections, Grace created a distraction, accidentally knocking over a glass of water that required his immediate attention. In those few seconds, she switched 2 of the syringes with her prepared vitamins. Not all of them, that would be too dangerous and too obvious, but enough to begin reducing the chemical fog that had trapped this child for years. The changes were subtle at first. On the 3rd day, Caleb's head turned toward the window when a snowy owl called from the pine trees. On the 5th day, his fingers drummed silently against his wheelchair arm when Grace hummed while folding laundry. By the end of the week, she caught him tracking her movements as she moved around the room. Mason noticed too. "He seems more present lately," he told Grace one evening as they stood watching Caleb in the sunroom. "More alert." "Children respond to consistency and attention," Grace replied carefully. "Sometimes they just need someone to believe they're capable of more." But her greatest discovery came when she was cleaning Mason's study and found the locked filing cabinet. Years of living with an abusive husband had taught her how to pick simple locks with a hairpin. Inside, she found folders labeled with clinical terminology that made no sense until she saw the patient numbers. Patient C47. Caleb's file. Patient S23. And there, paper clipped to the front, was a photograph that made Grace's blood freeze in her veins. Sarah Thompson, Mason's supposedly dead wife, looking hollow-eyed and vacant in what was clearly a hospital gown. The file was thick with medical records spanning 3 years. Not death certificates or funeral arrangements, but ongoing treatment records from Pine Ridge Psychiatric Facility, 2 hours north in Kalispell. Sarah wasn't dead. She was a patient in Dr. Thornfield's private psychiatric practice, receiving the same cocktail of drugs that was being used on her son. Grace's hands shook as she photographed every page with her phone. Treatment notes described Sarah as treatment-resistant and requiring increased sedation for patient safety. But reading between the lines, Grace saw a different story. A mother who'd tried to protect her son from a doctor's experimental treatments, who'd been silenced and hidden away when she became inconvenient. The most damning evidence was in the final folder, research protocols for a study titled Chemical Behavioral Management in Pediatric Neurodevelopmental Disorders. Caleb wasn't just a patient. He was a test subject in an unauthorized medical experiment that had been going on for 6 years. Grace sat back in the leather chair, her mind racing. She had enough evidence to destroy Dr. Thornfield's career and probably send him to prison. But she also had a 9-year-old boy who was finally beginning to emerge from years of chemical imprisonment, and a father who'd been living with the devastating lie that his wife was dead. Outside, the first real snow of winter began to fall, covering the mountains in pristine white. Grace watched the flakes drift past the window and made her decision. Some truths were too dangerous to reveal all at once, but some children were worth any risk. Tomorrow she would reduce Caleb's medications even further, and somehow she would find a way to reunite this family, even if it meant going to war with one of the most powerful doctors in Montana. December brought the kind of cold that made the mountains seem like another planet entirely. The lake had frozen solid, and snow piled against the mansion's windows in drifts that reached the 2nd floor. But inside the Thompson house, something extraordinary was happening. Caleb was waking up. Grace had been reducing his medications for 3 weeks now, substituting vitamin injections for nearly half of Dr. Thornfield's prescribed cocktail. The changes were undeniable. Caleb's eyes followed conversations now, his head turning toward sounds with obvious intent. Most remarkably, he'd begun making soft vocalizations, not words yet, but sounds that carried meaning. A low hum when he was content, a sharp intake of breath when startled. And once, when Grace was humming an old hymn her grandmother used to sing, he joined in with a wordless harmony that made her weep. Mason noticed everything. How could he not? His son was emerging from 9 years of chemically induced silence like a butterfly breaking free from a cocoon. But with that emergence came questions that terrified him. "Grace," he said one evening as they watched Caleb attempt to move his fingers in deliberate patterns, "what if Dr. Thornfield is right? What if reducing his medications triggers some kind of episode?" Grace looked at this man who'd built a fortune on protecting digital information but couldn't protect his own child from medical abuse. She'd grown to care deeply for Mason over these weeks, seeing past his wealth to the broken father underneath. But some truths couldn't be spoken gently. "Mr. Thompson, in 12 years of pediatric nursing, I never saw a child improve by being sedated into submission. Children don't need to be silenced. They need to be heard." That night, Grace made a decision that would change everything. She called her former colleague, Janet Morrison, who now worked for the Montana State Medical Board. They'd been friends since nursing school, and Janet was one of the few people Grace trusted completely. "Janet, I need to report a physician for what I believe is systematic medical abuse of children." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, Janet spoke. "Grace, honey, you know how serious these allegations are. Dr. Thornfield is practically a saint in this state. He's treated governors' children, senators' grandkids. You'd better have ironclad evidence." "I have files, Janet. Medical records showing unauthorized drug trials on children, and I think there are other victims. Send me everything you have. But Grace, be careful. Men like Thornfield don't go down quietly." The next morning, Grace began her most dangerous mission yet. She drove to Kalispell under the pretense of running errands for the household, but her real destination was Pine Ridge Psychiatric Facility. The building squatted against the Montana landscape like a concrete tumor, its windows small and barred, its grounds surrounded by chain-link fencing. Getting inside required all her old nursing credentials and a carefully constructed story about updating insurance information for the Thompson family. The receptionist, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, barely glanced at Grace's outdated ID badge before waving her toward the patient records office. What Grace found in Sarah Thompson's file made her physically ill. 3 years of medical records documented a woman's systematic destruction through pharmaceutical abuse. Sarah had been admitted following what Thornfield described as a psychotic break triggered by stress over her son's condition. But the real story was written between the lines. Sarah had questioned Caleb's treatment. She'd demanded second opinions. She'd threatened to report Thornfield to medical authorities, and for these crimes she'd been diagnosed with treatment-resistant delusional disorder and subjected to increasingly aggressive chemical interventions. The most recent entry, dated just 2 weeks ago, noted that Sarah had been unusually responsive lately, asking questions about her son and requesting to see her husband. Thornfield's response had been to increase her antipsychotic medications. Grace photographed every page, her hands shaking with rage. Then she did something that would either save this family or destroy her own life. She walked to Sarah's room. The woman sitting by the window bore little resemblance to the vibrant teacher in the family photos Grace had seen throughout the mansion. Sarah Thompson was gaunt, her dark hair streaked with premature gray, her eyes holding the familiar glassy quality of over-medication. But when Grace spoke her name, something flickered behind those drugged pupils. "Sarah? My name is Grace Parker. I'm taking care of Caleb." Sarah's head turned slowly, as if moving through water. "Caleb?" The word was slurred but unmistakably hopeful. "He's getting better, honey. He's starting to wake up." Tears began streaming down Sarah's face. They said he was dangerous, that I was imagining things. But I knew he was still in there." Grace spent an hour with Sarah, carefully explaining what she'd discovered about Thornfield's treatments. Sarah's responses were slow but increasingly coherent as the conversation progressed. It became clear that this woman's mind, while damaged by years of chemical assault, was far from broken. "He killed my baby," Sarah whispered, gripping Grace's hand with surprising strength. "Not with a knife, but with needles. He killed the boy Caleb could have been." "We're going to stop him," Grace promised. "But I need your help. I need you to remember everything you can about how this started." Sarah's story emerged in fragments, but each piece added to the horrifying picture Grace was assembling. Thornfield had approached the family when Caleb was diagnosed with autism at age 3. He'd presented himself as a pioneer in pediatric neurochemistry, promising revolutionary treatments that would normalize autistic children. "He said Caleb's brain was like a radio picking up too many stations at once," Sarah recalled. "That his medications would tune it to the right frequency. But when I asked questions, when I wanted to reduce the doses because Caleb seemed so distant, Victor said I was interfering with treatment. He said I was becoming delusional from stress." The trap had been elegant in its simplicity. Thornfield had isolated Sarah from other medical professionals by positioning himself as the only expert qualified to treat her son's complex case. When she'd grown increasingly concerned about Caleb's deteriorating condition, he'd reframed her maternal instincts as symptoms of mental illness. "One night I tried to flush Caleb's medications down the toilet," Sarah continued. "I wanted to see if he'd improve without them. Victor found out somehow. The next morning, 2 men came to the house with commitment papers. Mason thought I'd had a complete breakdown." Grace left Pine Ridge with a heart full of rage and a phone full of evidence. But she also left with something else. A message from Sarah to her husband that would either reunite a family or shatter the fragile progress they'd made. Back at the mansion, Grace found Mason in his study, staring at financial reports without really seeing them. Caleb was in his wheelchair nearby, and for the first time since Grace had arrived, the boy was awake and alert during his father's work time. "Mr. Thompson, we need to talk." Mason looked up, and something in Grace's expression made him close his laptop immediately. "What's wrong?" Grace had rehearsed this moment during the drive home, but no amount of preparation could make this easier. "Your wife isn't dead." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Mason's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, hope, and finally a terrible understanding. "That's not possible. I saw the death certificate. I attended the funeral." "You attended the funeral of a woman Dr. Thornfield declared legally incompetent." "Sarah is alive, Mason. She's been a patient at Pine Ridge Psychiatric Facility for 3 years, and she's been trying to get back to you and Caleb this entire time." Mason stood up so quickly his chair rolled backward. "You're lying. This is some kind of sick joke." Grace pulled out her phone and showed him the photographs she'd taken of Sarah's medical records. Mason's hands shook as he scrolled through the images, his face growing paler with each page. "She asked me to give you a message," Grace said gently. "She said to tell you that she never stopped believing in both of you, and that she's sorry she couldn't protect Caleb from the monster wearing a doctor's coat." From his wheelchair, Caleb made a sound that stopped both adults in their tracks. It wasn't quite a word, but it was clearly intentional communication. He was looking directly at his father, his eyes more focused than Mason had seen them in years. Duh. Caleb's voice was barely a whisper, rusty from disuse. Da-da. Mason dropped to his knees beside the wheelchair, tears streaming down his face. Son, do you understand what we're saying? Caleb's response was to reach out with trembling fingers and touch his father's cheek. The gesture was clumsy, uncoordinated from years of medication-induced paralysis, but it was unmistakably deliberate. My God, Mason breathed. What has that man done to my family? Grace knelt beside them both, her own tears falling freely. He's done terrible things, Mr. Thompson, but we're going to make him pay, and we're going to bring your wife home. Outside, the Montana wind howled through the pine trees, and snow continued to fall on the frozen lake. But inside the mansion, for the first time in years, there was hope. A family was beginning to remember what love looked like, and a 9-year-old boy was discovering that his voice, long buried under chemical restraints, still worked. Dr. Thornfield's carefully constructed lies were about to crumble, but Grace knew that bringing down a man with his power and reputation would require more than medical records and testimony from a discredited psychiatric patient. They would need allies, evidence that couldn't be dismissed, and most importantly, they would need Caleb to continue improving enough to serve as living proof of the crimes committed against him. The real fight was just beginning. December 21st arrived with the kind of blizzard that made national news. Wind speeds reached 60 miles per hour, and snow fell so thick that the world beyond the mansion's windows disappeared into white chaos. The power had been flickering all morning, and Mason paced the living room like a caged animal, his phone pressed to his ear as he argued with lawyers, medical board officials, and anyone else who might help him navigate the nightmare his life had become. Grace sat beside Caleb in the sunroom, watching the boy's remarkable progress continue, despite the storm raging outside. In just 1 week since learning about his mother, Caleb had spoken 17 distinct words. His favorites were snow, mama, and increasingly, Grace. His physical coordination was improving too. He could now grip objects intentionally and was beginning to show signs that the paralysis in his legs might not be permanent. But their peaceful morning shattered when Dr. Thornfield's Mercedes fought through the drifting snow and pulled into the circular drive. Grace felt her blood turn to ice as she watched the doctor emerge from his car, clutching an official-looking envelope and moving with the determined stride of a man who'd come to end a rebellion. "Mason!" Thornfield's voice boomed through the foyer as he shook snow from his expensive coat. "We need to discuss some very serious concerns about Caleb's care." Mason appeared from his study, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "Victor, I wasn't expecting you in this weather. The storm is nothing compared to the damage being done to your son." Thornfield's tone carried the authority of a man accustomed to unquestioned obedience. "I've received disturbing reports about medication irregularities. Caleb's treatment has been compromised, and I'm here to correct that immediately." Grace emerged from the sunroom, her hand protectively on Caleb's wheelchair. The boy's reaction to Thornfield's presence was immediate and visceral. His breathing quickened, his hands began to shake, and he made a low, whimpering sound that broke Grace's heart. "Doctor," Grace said, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, "as you can see, Caleb is responding well to his current care routine. Perhaps we could discuss any concerns after the storm passes." Thornfield's cold blue eyes fixed on Grace with laser intensity. "Miss Parker, you've forgotten your place. You're not a medical professional, and you have no authority to modify a patient's prescribed treatment." He held up the envelope. "This is a court order mandating immediate resumption of Caleb's full medication protocol. Any interference will result in criminal charges." Mason stepped forward, his jaw set in a way Grace had never seen before. And I have papers too, Victor. Guardianship documents giving me absolute authority over my son's medical care. You're no longer his doctor. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind howling against the windows. Thornfield's composed facade cracked for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. Mason, you're making a terrible mistake. Without proper medication, Caleb will suffer episodes that could result in serious self-harm. I've seen it before. Autistic children who become violent, destructive. Is that what you want for your son? What I want, Mason said, his voice rising, is to know why my wife is locked in your psychiatric facility when I was told she was dead. What I want is to understand why my son has been drugged into a coma for 6 years when he's clearly capable of communication and movement. Thornfield's face went ashen. I don't know what lies this woman has filled your head with, but Sarah died 3 years ago. You attended her funeral. You signed the death certificate. I signed papers you gave me, trusting you completely. But Grace visited Pine Ridge yesterday. She saw Sarah. She has medical records proving you've been experimenting on children for years. From his wheelchair, Caleb suddenly spoke with startling clarity. No more needles. The 3 adults turned to stare at the boy, who was looking directly at Dr. Thornfield with an expression of pure terror mixed with determination. No more needles, Caleb repeated, his voice stronger this time. Hurt! Stop! Hurt! Thornfield took a step backward, his composed demeanor finally crumbling completely. The boy is delusional. This is exactly the kind of confused thinking the medications prevent. Mason, if you don't allow me to resume treatment immediately, I'll have no choice but to involve Child Protective Services. Go ahead, Mason said, moving to stand behind his son's wheelchair. Call CPS. Call the police. Call anyone you want. But you're not touching my son again. The doctor's next move shocked everyone. Instead of leaving, he pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number. Sheriff Morrison, this is Dr. Thornfield. I'm at the Thompson residence and I need immediate assistance. There's a child in medical crisis and his father is preventing emergency treatment. Grace felt panic rising in her chest. She knew how these situations played out. Authority figures in crisis mode, split-second decisions made based on incomplete information, children removed from their homes for their own protection. She had to act fast. Mr. Thompson, take Caleb to the panic room in your study, she whispered urgently. I'll handle this. Mason hesitated for only a moment before wheeling his son toward the back of the house. Thornfield tried to follow, but Grace blocked his path with surprising physical presence. Doctor, I think you and I need to have a conversation about what really happened to Emma Walsh. Thornfield froze. I don't know what you're talking about. Emma Walsh, 7 years old, admitted to your care in Nashville with a diagnosis of ADHD, dead within 6 months from what you called complications from her condition. But I remember differently, Victor. I remember how you insisted on experimental treatments. I remember how you silenced anyone who questioned your methods. The color drained from Thornfield's face completely. You're Emma's mother. I was, before you killed her with your arrogance and your needles and your absolute certainty that you knew better than everyone else in the room. Outside, the sound of vehicles fighting through the snow announced the arrival of the sheriff's department. Grace knew she had minutes at most before the situation spiraled beyond anyone's control. Here's what's going to happen, Victor, she said, pulling out her phone and showing him the screen. I've been recording this entire conversation. I have your admission that you know who Emma was, which proves you lied about not recognizing my name. I have medical records from Pine Ridge showing you've been holding Sarah Thompson against her will, and I have enough evidence of medical malpractice to end your career and put you in prison. Thornfield's hands were shaking now. You don't understand. These children, They suffer without proper management. I've spent my career trying to help them. You've spent your career playing God with other people's children. But that ends today." The front door burst open, and Sheriff Morrison entered with 2 deputies, all of them covered in snow and looking grim. Grace recognized the sheriff from her research. Janet Morrison's cousin, a man with a reputation for fairness, but also for following protocol to the letter. "Dr. Thornfield, you reported a medical emergency?" Thornfield seemed to gather himself, reassembling his mask of professional authority. "Sheriff, thank you for coming. The child in this house is in severe medical distress. His father has been manipulated by this woman into stopping crucial medications. The boy could suffer permanent damage or even death without immediate intervention." Sheriff Morrison looked around the elegant foyer, taking in the expensive furnishings and the obvious tension between the adults. "Where is the child now?" "His father has barricaded them both in another room," Thornfield said. "I have a court order mandating treatment." "Actually," Grace interjected, "you have a court order that's no longer valid because Mr. Thompson has terminated your doctor-patient relationship. And I have evidence that you've been systematically abusing your authority to conduct unauthorized medical experiments on children." Sheriff Morrison held up his hands. "Folks, let's slow down. This is a lot of accusations flying around. What I need to see first is the child, to make sure he's safe and not in immediate danger." "Of course," Grace said. "But I want your word that no medical procedures will be performed until we can sort out the legal situation. You have it, Dr. Thornfield. You'll need to step back while I assess the situation." Grace led the sheriff through the mansion to Mason's study, where father and son had taken refuge behind a reinforced door. It took several minutes of careful negotiation, but eventually Mason agreed to open the door. What Sheriff Morrison saw changed everything. Instead of a violent, out-of-control child, he found a 9-year-old boy sitting calmly in his wheelchair, holding his father's hand and speaking in quiet, clear sentences about the snow outside the window. "Hello," Caleb said when he noticed the sheriff. "Are you here to stop the hurt man?" Sheriff Morrison knelt down to Caleb's eye level. "What hurt man, son?" "The needle man. He makes me sleep when I don't want to sleep. Grace makes the hurt stop." The sheriff stood slowly, his expression thoughtful. He'd seen enough abused children in his career to recognize the signs, and what he was seeing didn't match Thornfield's description of a dangerous, out-of-control child. "Dr. Thornfield," he called toward the foyer, "I think we need to have a different conversation." But when they returned to the front of the house, Thornfield was gone. His Mercedes was no longer in the driveway, and the only trace of his presence was melting snow on the marble floor. Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter storm. A cornered predator was always most dangerous, and Victor Thornfield had just realized that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "Sheriff," she said urgently, "you need to put out an alert. He's going to run, and there are other children at risk." Morrison was already reaching for his radio. "All units, be on the lookout for a silver Mercedes sedan, license plate." He paused, looking at Grace. "What's the plate number?" Grace closed her eyes, visualizing the car she'd watched so carefully over the past weeks. "Montana plates, VXT 4429. And Sheriff, you might want to send someone to Pine Ridge Psychiatric Facility. There's a woman there who's been held against her will for 3 years, and she has information that could save a lot of children." As the sheriff coordinated the search for Thornfield, Grace returned to the sunroom where Mason sat with Caleb, both of them watching the storm begin to subside. For the first time since she'd arrived at the mansion, Grace felt like they might actually win this fight. But she also knew that the most dangerous part was just beginning. Christmas Eve morning dawned clear and bitter cold, the kind of Montana winter day that made the air itself seem to crack with each breath. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world of pristine snow and deceptive beauty. But inside the Thompson mansion, the calm was shattered by a phone call that would turn their moment of hope into their darkest hour. Grace answered the phone in the kitchen while preparing Caleb's breakfast, expecting perhaps Sheriff Morrison with news about Dr. Thornfield's capture. Instead, she heard the trembling voice of a nurse from Pine Ridge Psychiatric Facility. "Ms. Parker, this is Nancy Williams from Pine Ridge. You visited patient Sarah Thompson yesterday?" "Yes," Grace said, her stomach already beginning to knot with dread. "I'm afraid I have to inform you that Mrs. Thompson suffered a severe medical crisis during the night. She's been transferred to Kalispell Regional Medical Center in critical condition." The bowl Grace had been holding slipped from her hands, shattering against the kitchen tiles in an explosion of ceramic and milk. "What kind of crisis?" "The doctors believe it was a reaction to medication adjustments. Her organs are, well, they're shutting down. The family should come immediately." Grace's knees buckled, and she gripped the kitchen counter to keep from falling. After 30 years of pharmaceutical abuse, Sarah's body was finally giving up. Just when her family was about to be reunited, just when there was hope for healing, the woman who'd fought so hard to protect her son was losing the battle for her own life. Mason appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the sound of breaking glass. One look at Grace's face told him everything he needed to know. "It's Sarah, isn't it?" Grace could barely speak past the tears clogging her throat. "She's dying, Mason. Her body can't handle the withdrawal from all those medications. We're losing her." The sound that came from Mason Thompson was unlike anything Grace had ever heard, a raw, animalistic howl of grief that seemed to tear itself from the deepest part of his soul. This man who'd built an empire through careful calculation and strategic thinking was reduced to a broken father and husband watching his world collapse again. "I have to go to her," he said, already moving toward the door. "I have to—" "The roads," Grace said, her nursing training kicking in despite her own devastation. "The interstate is still closed from the storm. It's a 4-hour drive on back roads in these conditions." Mason's face went white as he understood the impossible choice before him. He could attempt the treacherous journey to Kalispell and risk leaving Caleb alone and vulnerable, or he could stay with his son and let his wife die without ever seeing her husband again. "I'll go," Grace said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. "I can make it in my truck, and I know the mountain roads. You stay with Caleb." But as they stood in the kitchen, both of them trembling with grief and indecision, they heard a sound that made their blood freeze, the distant hum of helicopter rotors cutting through the morning air. Grace ran to the window and felt her heart stop. A medical helicopter was approaching the mansion, its red cross symbol clearly visible against the white landscape. But this wasn't a rescue mission. As the aircraft circled for landing, she could see Dr. Thornfield in the passenger seat, along with what appeared to be official personnel. "Mason!" she screamed. But he was already moving, racing toward Caleb's room with the desperate energy of a man who'd realized he was trapped in a nightmare that was only getting worse. The helicopter landed on the circular drive, its rotors whipping snow into a blinding cloud. Through the swirling white, Grace watched Dr. Thornfield emerge along with 2 men in official jackets marked Child Protective Services, and a woman carrying what was obviously a court order. Grace's mind raced through their options. Sheriff Morrison was dealing with road closures and storm damage across the county. Their lawyer was snowed in 3 hours away. Sarah was dying in a hospital 200 miles north. And now the system that was supposed to protect children was being weaponized against the very child they were trying to save. The knock on the front door was sharp and authoritative. Grace took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and prepared for the fight of her life. "Ms. Parker," Dr. Thornfield said when she opened the door, his voice carrying the cold satisfaction of a man who believed he'd already won. "I have emergency custody papers signed by Judge Harrison. Due to the clear and present danger to Caleb Thompson's health and safety, he's being removed from this home immediately for emergency medical intervention." Behind him, the CPS worker stepped forward with practiced efficiency. "Ma'am, we need to see the child immediately. Any interference with this order will result in criminal charges." Grace blocked the doorway with her body. "You're not taking him." "Miss Parker, step aside. You have no legal standing in this matter." "Actually," said a new voice from behind Grace, "she does." Mason appeared in the foyer, carrying a folder of documents and looking like a man who'd just made the most important decision of his life. "As of this morning, Grace Parker has been granted emergency guardianship of my son. These papers were filed electronically with the county clerk at 6 a.m. Dr. Thornfield's confidence wavered for the first time. "That's impossible. You can't grant guardianship to an unqualified caregiver." "I can, and I did." "Grace Parker is a licensed pediatric nurse with 12 years of experience. She's more qualified to make medical decisions for my son than anyone in this room." Mason's voice carried a steel that Grace had never heard before. "And as his legal guardian, she has the right to refuse any medical treatment she deems unnecessary or harmful." The CPS worker looked uncertain now, glancing between her court order and Mason's guardianship papers. "Sir, we still have concerns about the child's welfare. The reporting physician has indicated that stopping his medications could result in serious injury or death." "Then let's ask the child himself," Grace said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Caleb, can you come here, sugar?" The sound of wheelchair wheels on marble announced Caleb's approach. The boy appeared in the foyer, looking small and fragile in his pajamas, but with an alertness in his eyes that hadn't been there weeks ago. "Hi," Caleb said, looking directly at the strangers in his home. "Are you the people who want to give me needles?" The CPS worker knelt down to Caleb's level, her expression softening. "Hello, sweetie. We're here to make sure you're safe and healthy." "I am safe," Caleb said with remarkable clarity for a child who'd been nonverbal just weeks ago. "Grace keeps me safe. The needle man hurts me. Grace makes the hurt stop." Dr. Thornfield stepped forward aggressively. "The child is confused and delusional. This is exactly the kind of thinking the medications are designed to prevent. Without proper chemical management, he becomes prone to fantasies and false memories." "False memories?" Grace's voice rose to a shout. "Like the false memory that his mother is dead when she's actually dying in your psychiatric facility? Like the false memory that a paralytic drug is necessary to treat autism?" The helicopter pilot had been listening to the exchange with growing unease. "Doc, this doesn't feel right. The kid seems fine to me. Maybe we should—" "You're paid to fly, not to make medical decisions," Thornfield snapped. But his authority was cracking, and everyone could see it. It was Caleb who ended the standoff with 7 words that changed everything. "I want to see my mama." The CPS worker looked up at Dr. Thornfield with new suspicion. "Doctor, you told us the child's mother was deceased." "She is. The boy is having delusions brought on by medication withdrawal. This is exactly why emergency intervention is necessary." But Grace was already pulling out her phone, showing the CPS worker the photographs from Pine Ridge. Sarah Thompson, alive and currently dying at Kalispell Regional Medical Center because her body can't handle withdrawal from 30 years of unnecessary psychiatric medications. The official took the phone with trembling hands, scrolling through the medical records that Grace had photographed. Her face went pale as she read. "Ma'am," she said to Grace, "we need to contact our supervisor immediately. If these allegations are true—" She turned to Dr. Thornfield with an expression of disgust. "Sir, you're going to need to come with us for questioning." But Dr. Thornfield was already backing toward the helicopter, his composed facade completely shattered. "This is all lies and manipulation. That woman has poisoned everyone against legitimate medical treatment. The child will suffer without proper intervention. You'll see. You'll all see when he has an episode." As he reached the helicopter, he turned back with wild eyes. "I've dedicated my life to helping these children. I've given them peace. I've given them quiet. And this is how you repay me?" The helicopter lifted off in a whirlwind of snow and noise, carrying Dr. Thornfield away from the family he'd spent years destroying. But Grace felt no sense of victory. Sarah was still dying in a hospital bed, and they were still trapped by distance and weather from reaching her in time. Caleb's voice, small and clear in the sudden quiet, spoke the truth that broke all their hearts. "Is Mama coming home for Christmas?" Grace knelt beside his wheelchair, her own heart shattering as she looked into those trusting eyes. "I don't know, baby. I just don't know." The next 24 hours unfolded like a fever dream of desperate phone calls, emergency flights, and revelations that rewrote everything the Thompson family thought they knew about their lives. Sheriff Morrison had coordinated with authorities in 3 states to track Dr. Thornfield's helicopter, which had landed at a private airfield in Idaho before disappearing entirely. But the manhunt for one rogue doctor seemed insignificant compared to what Grace discovered when she finally reached Kalispell Regional Medical Center. Sarah Thompson wasn't dying from medication withdrawal. She was dying from systematic poisoning that had been disguised as psychiatric treatment for 3 years. The emergency room physician, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, had never seen anything like the cocktail of chemicals flowing through Sarah's bloodstream. "Whoever did this to her used her body as a laboratory," Dr. Rodriguez explained to Grace over the phone. "Lithium levels that should have killed her years ago. Antipsychotics in combinations that have never been approved for human use. And something else, something we can't even identify yet." Grace gripped the phone with white knuckles as she stood in the mansion's kitchen, watching Mason try to explain to Caleb why Mama was sick. "Can you save her?" "We're trying. But Ms. Parker, you need to understand. Her organs have been under assault for years. Even if we can stabilize her, the damage might be irreversible." That's when Grace made the connection that would change everything. "Doctor, I need you to run a specific test. Look for traces of pancuronium bromide in her system." The silence on the other end stretched for nearly a minute. "That's a paralytic agent used in surgical procedures. Why would you?" "Because the same doctor who's been treating her has been giving that drug to her 9-year-old son for the past 6 years. And I think we're about to discover that Sarah Thompson wasn't his first experimental subject." Dr. Rodriguez's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. "I'll run the test immediately. But Ms. Parker, if what you're suggesting is true, we're looking at one of the worst cases of medical malpractice in Montana history." Grace hung up and turned to find Mason standing in the doorway, his face etched with a mixture of hope and terror. "What did she say?" "She said we need to prepare for the possibility that Sarah's condition is worse than we thought. But Mason, there's something else. I think Thornfield has been using your family as test subjects for years. Sarah wasn't just a psychiatric patient, she was a human guinea pig." Mason's knees buckled and he grabbed the doorframe for support. "You mean he's been experimenting on them? On my wife and son?" "I think he's been testing drug combinations, studying their effects, documenting everything. And I think Sarah figured it out, which is why she had to be silenced." From the living room came Caleb's voice, stronger and clearer than they'd ever heard it. "Grace? Daddy? Why are you sad?" They found Caleb sitting in his wheelchair by the window, watching the snow fall on the frozen lake. But something was different about him. He was sitting straighter, his eyes more focused, his hands moving with purpose as he gestured toward them. "We're worried about Mama," Mason said, kneeling beside his son's chair. "She's very sick." Caleb studied his father's face with an intensity that was startling. The needle man made her sick too? Yes, son. The needle man made her sick too. I remember, Mama, Caleb said suddenly, his voice taking on a dreamy quality. Before the needles, she used to sing to me and read stories. And when I was scared, she would hold me until the scared went away. Grace felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to this child reclaim memories that had been buried under years of chemical fog. What else do you remember, sugar? I remember being able to walk before the needles made my legs stop working. Mama used to chase me in the garden and I would hide behind the big rocks by the water. Caleb's eyes suddenly sharpened with adult clarity. Grace, is Mama going to die like Emma did? The question hit Grace like a physical blow. In all their conversations, she'd never mentioned her daughter to Caleb. How do you know about Emma, baby? I heard the needle man talking to his helpers. He said Emma was practice for fixing me. He said Mama was practice for fixing other mamas who asked too many questions. Grace sank into a chair, her mind reeling. If Caleb was right, then Thornfield's crimes went far beyond medical malpractice. They were looking at a systematic pattern of human experimentation that had likely claimed multiple victims across multiple states. Caleb, she said carefully, can you remember anything else the needleman said? Any other names? The boy's face scrunched in concentration. There was a lady named Jennifer, and a boy named Marcus, and his eyes went wide with sudden terror. Grace, there are other children, right now, in the place with the white rooms and the smell like medicine. Grace's blood ran cold. You mean Pine Ridge? No, different place, smaller. He called it his special project place. Mason was already reaching for his phone. I'm calling Sheriff Morrison. If there are other children, but their conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles in the driveway. Through the window, Grace could see 3 black SUVs pulling up to the mansion, followed by Sheriff Morrison's patrol car. Men and women in FBI windbreakers were emerging from the vehicles, their breath visible in the cold air. The doorbell rang with official authority, and Grace answered to find a stern-faced woman in her 50s holding a federal badge. Ms. Parker, I'm Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI. We need to speak with you about Dr. Victor Thornfield and what you've discovered about his medical practices. The next hour was a whirlwind of federal agents, recording equipment, and questions that forced Grace to relive the worst moments of her life. But as she told her story, from Emma's death 6 years ago to Sarah's current condition, she watched the agent's expressions grow increasingly grim. Miss Parker, Agent Chen said when Grace finished her account, we've been investigating Dr. Thornfield for 2 years following reports from families in 4 different states. What you've given us is the first solid evidence we've needed to build a case. There are other families? Mason asked. 17 documented cases so far, children who died or suffered permanent damage under Thornfield's care, parents who were discredited, institutionalized, or worse when they questioned his methods. Agent Chen turned to Caleb, who had been listening to everything with remarkable composure. Son, you mentioned a place with white rooms. Can you tell us anything else about it? Caleb closed his eyes, his face straining with the effort of remembering through years of chemically suppressed memories. It's in the mountains, but not far mountains, close mountains. There's a sign with a bird on it, and inside there are children who can't talk because of the needles. Agent Chen and her team exchanged meaningful looks. We think we know where he's talking about. There's a private facility about 40 minutes north of here that's registered as a research clinic. We've been trying to get access for months, but Thornfield's lawyers have blocked every attempt. Not anymore, Mason said, his voice carrying the cold fury of a father who'd finally understood the full scope of what had been done to his family. I'm authorizing you to use any resources necessary to shut him down, money, legal teams, whatever you need. As the FBI agents coordinated their raid on Thornfield's facility, Grace received a call that changed everything. Dr. Rodriguez's voice was shaking with excitement and disbelief. "Ms. Parker, you were right about the pancuronium bromide, but that's not all we found. Sarah's blood contains traces of at least 14 different experimental compounds, most of which don't even have names yet. And here's the extraordinary part. Despite everything that's been done to her, her brain function is largely intact. The damage is primarily physical." Grace's heart began to race. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if we can flush these chemicals from her system and support her organs through the detox process, she might recover more than we initially thought. She's been fighting these drugs for 3 years, and somehow she's been winning." Grace looked across the room at Mason and Caleb, father and son reunited by the simple act of listening to each other for the first time in years. She thought about the 17 families who'd been torn apart by one man's twisted vision of healing. She thought about Emma, whose death might finally have meaning if it helped save other children. "Doctor," she said, "do whatever it takes to bring her home." As night fell on Christmas Eve, the Thompson mansion was filled with more activity than it had seen in years. FBI agents coordinated raids. Sheriff Morrison filed reports that would reshape the state's medical oversight system. And in the living room, Grace sat with Caleb as he slowly, carefully, began to tell her about the other children he'd seen in Thornfield's secret facility. But the most important moment came near midnight, when Grace's phone rang with the call they'd all been praying for. "Mr. Parker, this is Dr. Rodriguez. Sarah Thompson just opened her eyes and asked for her son." Grace looked at Caleb, who had fallen asleep in his wheelchair with his head resting against her shoulder. For the first time since arriving at the Thompson mansion, she allowed herself to believe that this family might actually survive what had been done to them. "Tell her," Grace whispered into the phone, "tell her that Caleb is waiting for her to come home." Outside, snow continued to fall on the Montana mountains, covering the world in pristine white. But inside the mansion, something that had been broken for years was finally beginning to heal. The truth was out. The monster had been exposed. And somewhere in a hospital room 200 miles away, a mother was fighting her way back to a son who'd never stopped believing she would return. Christmas morning was still hours away. But for the Thompson family, the season of miracles had already begun. 3 months later, spring had come early to Montana. The snow that had buried the Thompson mansion during those dark December days had melted into rushing streams that fed the lake, and the first brave crocuses were pushing through the thawed earth in Sarah's garden. But the real transformation wasn't in the landscape. It was in the family that had been reborn from the ashes of Dr. Victor Thornfield's crimes. Sarah Thompson sat on the sunroom couch, her legs curled beneath her as she watched her son take his first independent steps in 6 years. The physical therapy had been grueling, requiring months of work to rebuild muscles that had atrophied under chemical paralysis, but Caleb's determination had amazed every medical professional involved in his recovery. Now, at 9 years old, he was learning to walk all over again, his face bright with concentration as he navigated the distance between his father and the woman who had saved them all. "Grace, watch this!" Caleb called out, his voice strong and clear. He took 7 careful steps before Mason caught him in a celebratory hug, both of them laughing with the pure joy of a milestone that had once seemed impossible. Grace wiped tears from her eyes as she sat beside Sarah, marveling at how much this family had healed in such a short time. Sarah's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. The doctors had warned that decades of pharmaceutical abuse might leave her permanently impaired, but her mind had proved remarkably resilient. The woman beside her now bore little resemblance to the hollow-eyed patient Grace had found at Pine Ridge. Sarah's dark hair had regained its shine, her eyes sparkled with intelligence and humor, and most importantly, she radiated the fierce protectiveness of a mother reclaiming her role. "I still can't believe he's really here," Sarah whispered. her voice thick with emotion. For 3 years I dreamed about holding him again, about hearing his voice. Some days, the dreams were all that kept me sane. Grace squeezed Sarah's hand. He never stopped believing you'd come home. Even when he couldn't speak, even when the medications made everything foggy, he held on to the memory of his mama. The transformation in their family dynamics had been beautiful to witness. Mason, once a distant workaholic who'd hidden his grief behind financial success, had become a hands-on father who read bedtime stories and helped with homework. Sarah, freed from the chemical fog that had stolen 3 years of her life, threw herself into motherhood with the passion of someone who'd been given a second chance. And Caleb, emerging from his medically induced prison, was discovering the world with the wonder of a child seeing everything for the first time. But perhaps the most profound change was in Grace herself. The woman who'd arrived in Montana, broken by loss and searching for redemption, had found something she'd never expected, a family that chose her as much as she'd chosen them. The legal guardianship papers had been amended to make her a permanent part of Caleb's life, and both Sarah and Mason insisted that she wasn't an employee or even a friend, but family in every sense that mattered. "Grace," Sarah said suddenly, turning to face her with serious eyes, "I need you to know something. I've been thinking about this for weeks, and I can't put it off anymore." Grace felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Despite the happiness of the past months, she still carried the fear that this new life was too good to be true, that somehow she'd lose this family just as she'd lost Emma. "What is it, honey?" Sarah took Grace's hands in both of hers. "Mason and I have been talking, and we want to ask you something important. We know you came here as Caleb's caregiver, and legally you're his guardian, but—" She paused, tears gathering in her eyes. "Grace, would you consider letting us adopt you as Caleb's second mother? Officially, legally, permanently?" Grace stared at Sarah in shock, her mind struggling to process what she'd just heard. "You want to—" "What?" "We want to make you Caleb's legal parent, alongside us. We want your name on his school records, your signature on his medical forms, your voice in every decision about his future." Sarah's words came faster now, as if she'd been holding them back for weeks. "Grace, you saved our son when we couldn't. You gave him back his voice, his movement, his future. But more than that, you love him like your own child, and he loves you like a mother." From across the room, Mason looked up from where he was helping Caleb with a puzzle. "Grace, Sarah's right. You're not just part of this family. You are this family. We want to make it official." Grace felt something break open in her chest, a dam of grief and guilt that she'd been carrying since Emma's death. For 6 years, she'd believed that she'd failed as a mother, that she hadn't fought hard enough to save her daughter from Thornfield's experiments. But looking at Caleb now, walking, talking, laughing, she finally understood that love wasn't measured by whether you could prevent every tragedy, but by whether you were willing to fight for healing when tragedy struck. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "Yes, I would be honored to be Caleb's second mother." The celebration that followed was interrupted by the doorbell, and Grace went to answer it, expecting perhaps a delivery or a neighbor. Instead, she found Agent Chen standing on the porch, but the FBI agent's usual serious expression had been replaced by something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Agent Chen, please come in." "Is there news about the trial?" "There is indeed." Chen stepped into the foyer, nodding politely to the family gathered in the sunroom. Dr. Victor Thornfield was convicted on all counts this morning. 47 counts of medical malpractice, 19 counts of child endangerment, 12 counts of conducting unauthorized human experiments, and 6 counts of kidnapping. Grace felt her knees go weak with relief. "What's his sentence?" life in prison without possibility of parole. And Miss Parker, there's more. The judge ordered that all of Thornfield's assets, his medical practice, his research facility, his personal wealth, be liquidated to create a victims' compensation fund. The families he destroyed will finally get some measure of justice. From the sunroom came Caleb's voice. Is the Needleman going away forever? Agent Chen smiled, the first time Grace had ever seen the stern federal agent's expression soften. Yes, son. The Needleman is going away forever. He can never hurt you or any other children ever again. Good, Caleb said with simple finality. Now can we have ice cream? The adults laughed, marveling at how children could process even the most complex emotions and then move on to what really mattered: ice cream, puzzles, and the simple joy of being loved and safe. That evening, as the spring sunset painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and pink, the 4 members of the Thompson family sat on the deck overlooking the lake. Sarah and Mason shared the porch swing, their fingers intertwined as they watched their son practice walking on the wooden planks. Grace sat in a nearby chair, marveling at how peaceful this moment felt after so many months of chaos and fear. Grace, Caleb said suddenly, pausing in his walking practice to look at her with serious eyes. Are you going to stay forever now? If you'll have me, sugar, forever and always. Good. Because I have something to tell you. Caleb walked over to her chair and climbed into her lap with the easy affection of a child who'd never doubted he was loved. I remember Emma. Grace's breath caught in her throat. You remember my Emma? From before the needles made me forget things. She was in the place with the white rooms. She told me to remember that her mama loved her, and that someday her mama would find another little boy who needed love too. Caleb snuggled against Grace's chest. She told me to tell you that she's not sad anymore, and that she likes that you're my second mama now. Grace felt tears streaming down her face as she held this remarkable child who'd somehow carried a message from her daughter through years of chemical suppression. Whether Caleb's memory was literal truth or the beautiful fiction of a healing mind didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd given her permission to love again, to be a mother again, without guilt or shame. Thank you, baby, she whispered into his hair. Thank you for bringing me home. As darkness fell over the lake, the family moved inside for their evening routine. Sarah helped Caleb with his bath while Mason started a fire in the living room fireplace. Grace prepared hot chocolate in the kitchen, smiling as she listened to the sounds of normal family life, laughter from the bathroom, the crackle of logs catching fire, the comfortable domestic rhythm of people who belong together. Later, after Caleb had been tucked into bed with stories and songs and all the love 3 parents could provide, the adults sat by the fire talking about their plans for the future. Mason had established a foundation to support families affected by medical abuse. Sarah was considering returning to teaching, perhaps specializing in working with children who'd experienced trauma. And Grace was thinking about going back to school to become a family advocate, using her experience to help other families navigate the medical system. You know what I realized today? Sarah said, curling up against Mason's shoulder. We're not the same family we were before all this happened. We're better, stronger, more honest with each other. That's what trauma can do, Grace said thoughtfully. It can destroy you, or it can burn away everything that wasn't essential and leave you with what really matters. And what really matters? Mason asked. Grace smiled, thinking of Emma's message delivered through Caleb's recovered memories, of Sarah's fierce love that had survived 3 years of chemical imprisonment, of Mason's transformation from distant provider to devoted father, of her own journey from broken nurse to beloved mother. Love, she said simply. Love that shows up every day, even when it's hard. Love that fights for people even when the system says they can't be saved. Love that believes in healing even when the experts say it's impossible. 6 months later, on a brilliant October morning, exactly 1 year after Grace had first driven up the mansion's circular driveway, the Thompson family stood in the courthouse in Kalispell as a judge made their unconventional family legally official. Grace Parker Thompson, for she'd taken their name as they'd taken her heart, placed her hand on the Bible and swore to love and protect Caleb Thompson as his legal mother for the rest of her life. The courtroom was packed with families whose children had been saved from Thornfield's facility, with FBI agents who'd become friends, with medical professionals who'd learned to question authority and listen to patients. But for Grace, the only people who mattered were the man, woman, and child standing beside her, holding her hands as she became officially what she'd been in her heart for months, a mother again. After the ceremony, they drove home through mountains blazing with autumn color, the same road Grace had traveled in fear and desperation a year ago, now feeling like a pathway to joy. Caleb chattered excitedly from his car seat about the party they were planning, about the cake Sarah was making, about the fact that he now had 2 moms, and wasn't that the luckiest thing in the world. As they pulled into the driveway, Grace saw that the mansion had been transformed by streamers and balloons, that neighbors and friends had gathered to celebrate this family that had been broken and healed, lost and found, silenced and given voice again. "Welcome home, Mom," Caleb said as Grace lifted him from his car seat, his arms wrapping around her neck with the fierce love of a child who'd learned not to take such moments for granted. "Thank you, baby," Grace replied, carrying him toward the house where Sarah and Mason waited with smiles bright enough to light up the Montana sky. "Thank you for choosing me too." Inside, the mansion that had once echoed with silence and sorrow now rang with laughter and music and the beautiful chaos of a family celebration. And in the garden outside, where spring flowers had given way to autumn blooms, the wind carried the sound of joy across the lake, toward the mountains, and into a future filled with endless possibilities for love, healing, and hope. Some families are born, others are forged in fire and choose each other with the fierce deliberation of people who know that love is not a feeling but a decision to show up, to fight, to heal, and to never, ever give up on each other. The Thompson family had made that choice, and they would keep making it every day for the rest of their lives. Dear friends, this story isn't just about one family's triumph over medical betrayal. It's about the power we all possess to recognize when something isn't right and find the courage to act. How many times have we, as parents and grandparents, been told to trust the experts while our instincts screamed otherwise? Grace Parker's journey reminds us that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from prestigious degrees or expensive treatments, but from someone who simply pays attention and refuses to accept that suffering is inevitable. In our golden years, we've learned that family isn't always about blood. It's about people who choose to show up when life gets hard. Sarah's 3-year fight against chemical imprisonment, Mason's transformation from distant provider to devoted father, and Caleb's miraculous recovery all happened because one woman decided that love was worth fighting for. The greatest prescription for healing isn't found in any pharmacy. It's found in the willingness to listen, to question authority when necessary, and to believe that broken things can be made whole again. Your voice matters. Your instincts matter. Your love can change everything. What moment in your life taught you to trust your instincts over expert opinion? Have you ever been the Grace in someone else's story, the person who noticed what others missed? Share your experiences in the comments below.